Welcome back to the second part of Chapter 4. In this part of the chapter, we're going to talk about the different sub-regions of Europe and kind of how they are distinct, excuse me. And so we have Northern Europe, the European core, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe, and we'll talk about their differences. The European core is not in the middle of Europe. It is often called Western Europe. And so this is the idea of the core versus the periphery. So the European core is very much considered to be the economic hub of the region. It is the earliest location of the Industrial Revolution. So the wealthiest countries are in the European core. It is the center of economy, government, and culture for Europe. Then we have Northern Europe, often referred to as Scandinavia, which has a much harsher climate and soil. It is all very culturally similar, though. Um, there's a picture of Copenhagen right there. If you even look at the flags of the countries in Scandinavia, they all look very, very similar. They were later to develop than the European core, but today they are very, very wealthy. They have a very egalitarian way of life, so very high levels of social services, very low poverty, and they have very high taxes, but those taxes go into these social programs that prevent a lot of uh, poverty and people being disenfranchised. Relatively small populations because they cannot really grow the food there to have large populations, and it has the harshest climate of the area. Then you have Southern Europe. There's a picture of Venice, Italy there. And this is where you have that Mediterranean climate that is very similar to Southern California. And so countries Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and Malta. Um, they had very early agriculture there, very old civilizations. Think about Rome, which obviously spread out. They were later to industrialize, and so they are less developed than the core and the north, but certainly many, many wealthy countries in this area. When we talk about the economics of the region, we'll talk about how a lot of these countries were hit the hardest by the economic collapse of 2008. And so this kind of late to industrialize, not as wealthy as the European core and Northern Europe has led to some of the economic problems that we see today. Then you have Eastern Europe, um, which goes from Estonia to Albania. It is very, very diverse region. Lots of different cultures, climates, landscapes, and economies. Their connection is that they are all former communist countries. Um, and so some of them are very kind of closely related to when we talk about Russia and the near abroad are countries that used to be part of the former USSR. These countries were kind of behind the wall, and they were much more closely aligned with the USSR. This is a picture that I took in Croatia, where you can see you're driving along this beautiful coastline, but then you see these huge communist block housing projects, which you can also see here in Bucharest, Romania. And we'll learn a lot more about these when we talk about Russia and the near abroad. The population of Europe, there's about 532 million people living in the region compared to the US, which has about 320 million. It is very, very urbanized and dense. So if we want to look at individual countries, Germany has about 81 million people. Italy and France have about 60 million people. Malta, 415,000 people. Iceland, lower than that, 320,000 people. And so when we look at a cartogram of the area, so again, each of these blocks is representing population size. We can see smaller populations in that north, in that harsher climate, big populations in Germany and France and Italy, Spain, the UK. And so remember we talked about these population uh, graphs a lot, and we're going to keep looking at them as we proceed throughout the semester. But we're going to talk about some population trends in the region. They have a problem called birth dearth, which means less and less people are having children or not having as many children. And so you have this aging of the population. Here's one for Italy, here's one for Germany, right? So you have this bubble that is going to keep rising as less and less people have fewer and fewer children. So much slower natural growth. And the implications of this are that you have a smaller workforce at the bottom here supporting this aging population. So you have this large dependent elderly population. And so some of the solutions to this problem are tax credits for babies, right? Really kind of incentivizing people to have children, which Italy and France have done and a few other countries, and also immigration. A lot of these countries would benefit from people who immigrate to the country who are of working age because they can help bolster that working class. And so if we look at the population of Germany, you can see their population going down, but you can see this bubble that rises up. So this aging population. So we're starting here, and then we're going to have fewer and fewer people to support this aging population. The region is heavily urbanized. About 80% of people in Europe are living in urban areas. These cities are not growing very much today. They don't really have the capacity to. Um, and so this is kind of unique among regions. A lot of other regions, cities are growing very, very fast. When we talk about sub-Saharan Africa, you have just cities there that have exponential growth. Um, the growth that is happening in cities is mostly fueled by migration, people coming in and looking for jobs. And most cities are very, very, very old. And so we'll talk about the layout of these cities as well. But cities like Prague and Paris, much, much older than cities in the United States. And so when we look at city patterns, we have three kind of three aspects of the European city pattern happening here. First is kind of this organic growth at the city center. So here is a picture in Split, Croatia that I took, right? This is obviously pre-automobiles, right? So you have this very, very old city center that just kind of expanded and grew out as people showed up. It is medieval, it is unplanned. There are these very, very narrow streets, which I'll provide you with some links to look at. It is generally speaking the most desirable place to live, right in the middle of that city center. It tends to be the most expensive. Um, then you have this inorganic growth that happened from the 1800s on, where you get this centralized planning. And so we can see here the Champs-Élysées in Paris, really, really wide street. You have this ring that surrounds the old city and much wider streets. And again, I'll provide you with another link to kind of look and see what that looks like. And then on the outskirts, and here's a Paris suburb, you have this socialist industrial growth. And so in European city patterns, your low income housing or your housing projects are happening on the outskirts of the city. And so they're very, very planned, and they're at the edge of the city. And so a lot of problems that Europe has having with homegrown terrorists are people who grew up in these housing projects who felt very disattached from the rest of European culture. And so you can see here some graffiti that's on that building to show the type of relationship that some people living in these areas have with the police. And so again, you'll have another link there that you'll be able to click on huge housing projects and to see what they look like. And many, many cities were rebuilt after World War II for obvious reasons. The the war really decimated many, many parts of these European cities. Um, and so these housing projects are often the location of migrant populations as well. So they are not living in that city center. We're going to talk a little bit about European cultural diversity. We have many, many different languages, ethnicities, and cultures living in a pretty small region. Um, Mountains and rivers isolated some populations, allowed kind of separate cultural evolution. So while we have a river here, between Romania and Bulgaria that kind of blocked some things off and allowed these languages to develop separately. Certainly easier than when you think about to cross over the Alps. You can think about the cultural difference between Germany and Italy, how different their language is. So if you were accessible, this enabled cultural exchange. So if your physical geography did not get in the way, you're more likely to have be from the same language group, have more culturally in common. When we look at the political geography of Europe, it is a reflection of the cultural geography. So we have a small area, but with many, many countries. The average country in Europe is the size of Arkansas, and that map is changing constantly. You're gonna watch a video that looks at how that map of Europe has changed over the past 1,000 years, and little countries come up, big countries come up, little countries come back. Um, and this happens through wars and conquests, and you'll see the expansion of the Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Um, Often, these countries are striving for nation states. So you have people who define themselves as a distinct ethnic group, and they want to rule themselves, right? They don't necessarily want to be part of a larger country, which we'll talk about in a little bit later in this chapter. We have some microstates, which are very, very tiny independent countries: Andorra, Monaco, Liechtenstein, San Marino, the Vatican. These are a legacy of city-states that existed before. They are independent but highly reliant on the rest of Europe, and they have very, very specialized economies. The Vatican is, the home of the Catholic Church, and then you have a place like Monaco, which is a home to a lot of gambling. And so again, we have this devolution of power, this decentralization of power, often for ethnic minorities. And so even though this has happened quite a few times, there's a lot of pushes happening in parts of Europe, which is going to be what your next exercise is going to be about, people trying to break off from these larger countries and rule themselves. So we have some independence movements that are happening, um, and that separatism is driven by nationalism, right? We are this group of people, we are this distinct ethnic group of people, and we want to rule ourselves and have a country that is culturally distinct. Um, in Europe, this is a mostly peaceful democratic process, but what you're going to see in the news that's happening right now with Catalonia is that it is not necessarily. It's mostly, we don't have any kind of civil wars going on right now, but we certainly do have some violence and protests. So what you're going to read about, hopefully for your next assignment, is looking at some of these independence movements. But you have Catalonia, which is trying to break off from Spain. Scotland recently voted to stay as part of the UK and not leave. Although with Britain leaving the European Union, there's talk that they might vote again in order to leave and become their own distinct country and not part of the UK. So that's the end of part 2 for chapter 4. You're going to proceed on to your exercise and then watch the last part of chapter 4 for this module. And then we'll pick up with the next part of chapter 4 in the following module.